Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back with another live stream of video game news. First we'll do the warm-up section, then we'll jump into the news. Today is Monday, December 23rd, so the eve of Christmas Eve, which I suppose you could go back 365 days, going eves of eves of eves. So inherently I don't expect there to be too much new news today anyways. People are more than likely on average not playing games, although if we look at the 24-hour concurrent line here as far as the Steam DB charts, there still are plenty of players slash bots. In fact, that number is extremely high for Counter-Strike 2 today. I guess I really have been overlooking the fact that there is a lot more to Counter-Strike Go and Counter-Strike 2 as it's now been renamed, as far as the third party not really being curtailed much at all by Valve, skin gambling and skin trading for real world cash websites out there that almost certainly is the reason why Counter-Strike 2, and previously known as CSGO, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, has made it so consistently into the 24-hour concurrent #1 spot. One, because there's a bunch of bots trying to get skins to then try and sell them on third-party sites, and two, because there's a bunch of, I would imagine, heavily percentaged underaged gamblers that are getting CS2 skins and then going to shady websites that aren't verifying ages or anything to sell it for real world cash. I was reminded of this looking at a recommended YouTube video. And so yeah, gambling is key. So inherently, if gambling was allowed legally everywhere, we'd probably see the Steam database website just full of gambling apps exclusively, which is probably not good for society if that was to happen. Like, eventually, maybe it'll happen 30 years from now, maybe it'll happen 100 years from now. Eventually Valve is going to just have to pull the plug on their Steam marketplace, and at the very least third-party trading or third-party access on websites. The API there, I can see them pulling the API in particular and saying all trading must be done on our marketplace. Then at the very least it is just money being traded and skins being bought and sold only on Steam, instead of the third-party websites that are adding more gambling elements to it. Inherently though, even if they pulled third-party access, the skin drops in Counter-Strike 2, unless they stop being random and start being more procedural and start being more repetitive, then you're still having a random drop element based on either playtime or wins for items that have perceived value on the storefront. And honestly, I could see Valve just getting rid of its marketplace altogether. They clearly don't care at all about trading cards and badges and gems and all the other things that are available on the marketplace, even selling and trading games. Really, that's where the marketplace really should be. Is it should just be the place where I've got an extra copy of this game, let me sell it back. Although at a certain point, just selling it back to Steam for credit would be way better of a situation. Yeah. But yeah, what I was saying otherwise, and seems like looking at this chart I'm probably being proven wrong, is that in my memory, most people don't tend to play video games too much on the eve of Christmas Eve, but I guess maybe you could get a free day there and do some gaming. Certainly Christmas Eve and Christmas tends to be days where I would think you're just not going to be playing a lot of video games. Although, who knows, maybe we're just living in a completely different world today too. I mean, if you don't want to deal with your family, as most people don't these days, if everything has just gotten super politically hot, depending on whatever politics you're even talking about, whether that's actual US political politics or whether it's just different worldviews in general, like maybe families just don't talk to each other. Maybe it is very much more of a case where everybody is just separating to different sides of the house and playing video games and staying away from each other. Which, in fairness, that has always been kind of the case, and the movies and TV have pushed out this concept that families always get together way more than it really is the truth. I mean, even like 200 years ago, you would have families that were moving to entirely different cities to get away from each other, never speaking to each other again, straight up shooting each other. It just happened quite a bit, certainly. Plus, you have to remember that the further you go back in time, the more you have the tyranny of, for lack of a better term, and I think this is the best term, of patriarchy, in that whoever the male father or unit of a family was, his word was law, and anyone that dared to even question it would get, at the very least, slapped across the face. So there was a lot of internalized disagreement that was not allowed for even to be even up to discussion. This has nothing to do with video games, though. Marvel Rivals here is still doing very well. Path of Exile 2, everything seemingly doing well, and I'm even a little happy to see Banana start to fall down lower. There was more of a controversy around the announced DLC crossover with Helldivers 2 and a different game. What was the other game called? Well, I can't remember the name of it. In it, the crossover content was like way more expensive as far as what you were getting, and just very poor value as a potential pay to win items that were way more expensive. Now for me, I am still running into a growing problem, which is creating a growing dissatisfaction in me, and that I'm still needing to clean house. I managed to step on something and I have some kind of splinter in my foot now. Hopefully I fixed it last night. I hope I did. But I mean, that was almost inevitable too, because I'm cleaning the house so much that little things, wood splinters, possibly even glass splinters, falling on the floor were almost guaranteed to happen. So yeah, and I'm just in general not making a lot of progress. Like, if I manage to do one or two things, and certainly I'm not 100% motivated towards working all out and overexhausting myself trying to clean house, and declutter and reorganize. I did figure out, I think, a solid concept as far as reorganizing my kitchen, in that one side of the sink is going to be the prep side, and one side of the sink is going to be the serve side. Inherently, the serve side is next to the dishwasher. That means dishes that you use to serve food will be right as close as possible to the dishwasher, thus they can be put up in cabinets right above the dishwasher. whereas the other side doesn't have any kind of utility like that, but does have a bunch of drawers and extra storage. And that's the prep side, where you're preparing food. So that's where you would be chopping vegetables or meat, preparing something to go into the oven, and that side is closer to the oven. So by just creating that separation, you have a logical concept of one side has these kinds of dishes and these kinds of utensils, the other side has the prep sides, the can openers, the scissors, the shears, things like that. Yeah. And so yeah, that's the beginning of some logical organization, and starting with just that first rule that helps me continue down the path of organizing, but it is extremely slow progress. And there definitely are going to be people that are going to just say, why am I bothering to organize the kitchen when there's several other rooms that need my attention potentially faster? But inherently, I kind of need to do everything at once. Like, I need, for my goals, I need everything to be done before I can take the next step. And so you can't just pick and choose. And so, yeah, I'm sure I will hear platitudes like you can't do it all at once, which is a admitting of defeat, effectively. Because right now I'm uniquely in a situation where I'm the only person that really has to deal with a house being out of order in the process of organizing and cleaning. If and when that changes, and then there's multiple people walking around living their day-to-day lives, there's not going to be an opportunity for spring cleaning. And I imagine that affects like families particularly too, is that unless you're going to just clean your entire house during a summer break, and have the rest of your family do nothing but help you clean the entire house during that spring break, or which really would probably be just a week, for most people, everybody else is going to be trying to live their normal lives, and they're going to be stepping over things and moving things around, and they're just not going to be generally happy with things being pulled out of drawers. Or in my case, pulling drawers out to wash them thoroughly, which even that I'm not really accomplishing. So yeah, that's been my continued frustration, which is leading towards a continued frustration, certainly, of not playing any video games and making any content. I really am only about 40 subscribers away from having 1,000 subscribers, and I am about 2,000 watch hours away from really having the 4,000 watch hours that I would need. So there is a possibility by this time next year I could be back in the YouTube Partner Program, although I imagine it still may not happen, and it certainly has taken 10 years to get nowhere on a YouTube channel, and I imagine a YouTube channel being that old is just not going to be in the algorithm and promoted. The hope was that my old content would be more legacy content, and that it would bring in new eyes always, and that's just not how YouTube's algorithm has been programmed. I'm also wasting a lot of time watching variations on the theme as far as fantasy anime series, which I kind of miss the 80s fantasy anime series that were a little bit more slower paced, where you would introduce a bad guy and then work towards defeating that bad guy over the course of 36 episodes or longer, where a single episode very well would just be part or maybe one whole enemy, one whole fight being shown. Now, I don't want to ever get back to Dragon Ball Z levels where they're just stretching for time that much, but watching things like that time I was reincarnated as a slime, which only season 1 of that is actually available on Hulu, so there's 3 other seasons I'm not capable of watching, which I should probably do research before watching anything particularly anime based on Hulu because of that. Like I've run into series that just kind of end. I've run into series that are still airing. It's just that nightmare of getting back to watching live TV that I don't really want to engage with. But yeah, series like that time I got reincarnated as a slime, which is a fine series, just rush through it though nowadays. Unlike the 80s fantasy ones that would take too long, these are now taking too little. And what's funny is it clearly is a reaction to video games and fantasy video games where you're just grinding like crazy. So these light novel animes, these isekai animes, these fantasy animes are all saying, well, we want to get rid of the grinding, so let's tell a story where we can just not show any of that. But they've taken it to an extreme where there are episodes where they just go several months later, and it's just like, several months later? I kind of wanted to go on the journey with you. And so, yeah. The first season of that time I was reincarnated as a slime in particular highlights this, and that clearly the first season is supposed to be about him building this new city for monsters and uniting all the monsters of the forest together under one banner, and yet there's a good 6 or 7 episodes after that in the first season where he goes and does a completely different thing, and the whole thing is just like way too rushed. Enemies get defeated and become part of his followers way too quickly. The fights against enemies are way too short. There's particularly like one character whose fight almost in its entirety is in the opening sequence, and that's the only time you even the protagonist fights that character. Like they do this very short fight, then she joins his team. Just really too rushed. So inherently, that is building into me this desire to play a real fantasy RPG. Now, I still don't want to grind, not like crazy, but I'd be willing to do a 60-hour RPG, certainly, in kind of just an accelerated fashion. But yeah, I definitely don't think anything would ever convince me to do, say, a 200-hour fantasy RPG. And that's kind of irritating me because I know I'm not going to get around to being able to play a game like that for a very long time. And in reality, just getting back to playing Borderlands the pre-sequel is probably going to satisfy my general RPG desire so much that I imagine finishing Borderlands pre-sequel is not going to have me want to play a fantasy-based RPG game. I just don't have a big enough tank of tolerance for fantasy RPGs like Japanese players have developed over their lifetimes playing Dragon Quest games, where I could just constantly feel happy playing in a JRPG or a fantasy RPG in general. If I was going to do it, it would probably be something like playing Yu-Gi-Oh! During these live streams, and I don't see how that would work either, to potentially just grind out like crazy while trying to cover video game news. And because it's Christmas, nothing else is really going to happen, and that's irritating, because like kind of running low on groceries. it would be, I wanted to try and wait until the new year to order more groceries, but maybe I won't be able to do that. My last grocery order was screwed up because it almost certainly was a overworked, overrushed worker, maybe a temporary seasonal worker who delivered them. And I suppose I could waste a lot of time and go to the grocery store myself, but man, do you want to even go to a grocery store between December 25th and January 1st? Yeah, I don't think you do. Yeah, certainly. There's more things I would like to have progress, and just no. The world shuts down in the United States pretty much. You can see deadlock here is about to fall completely off my chart. My macros did not run well at all today, so I just manually opened everything. Excuse me, sorry about that. I've also given up on my alarm clock and am now just waking up more naturally when the sun comes up, like I imagine humans are supposed to. But with that, my schedule still is really terrible in that I'm waking up at like maybe 11 or 12 at noon, and then not really accomplishing much between noon and 8 and 9 in the evening, and then thinking, oh, this is the time I should go to sleep, and then really staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning after that. And it's particularly too cold to do anything between like 10 and 2 and 3 in the morning. That is more of a factor of just insomnia. And I've always had horrible insomnia as far as just spending hours and hours trying to go to sleep every night. Yep. I did see that DF Retro, there's not, I think, anything more to really say on my chart. DF Retro is doing its own small People's Choice Game of the Year thing. You might have to be a Patreon member. I wouldn't be surprised if there is actually a lot of that happens, where if you are a Patreon member of some video game website, DF Retro being kind of different, they might have their fans voting for games. But it is really just incredibly irrelevant unless it has some more pomp and circumstance to it. It doesn't have to be as huge as the Game Awards, but there has to be a presentation, there has to be some kind of event around it, and some spectacle around it in particular, for it to even begin to start to feel like it has any relevance. So just having a list on a website is not really good enough. And that's even true for the Steam Awards here, is that presentations of the winners on the Steam Awards have been pathetically under budgeted. Oh yeah, I haven't done the discovery queue. I forgot about that. And yeah, there's not going to be anything else really on sale different from the winter sales. I've seen several people make little YouTube videos of here's 5 games on sale right now, but you'd think there's more of that. I actually watched some gameplay of Balercho, and yeah, it seems like that's kind of a crazy, silly, kind of complicated game. No image loading here at all when I hover. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure I'd really enjoy Belantro too much, but it might be a game that you just kind of play in a shorter amount of time. You're just in and out. Inherently with my YouTube channel, without going into too much details, obviously anybody who's been running a YouTube channel for 10 years and was hoping to be monetized at any point there, they would have hoped that that would have happened way quicker. And definitely I've seen YouTubers that have way more success in even 1 year, whereas honestly, if you haven't succeeded in 2 years of attempts on YouTube, you definitely should give up. For most people's situation, my situation was very weird and still is. But yeah, I definitely think and had hoped that I would have been monetized at least 5 years ago, and that this channel had been making maybe not enough to pay the bills, but a significant helpful amount. That certainly would have motivated me to make more content, to hire people to make better content. But yeah, inherently that's not how it went. And it was pretty much a pipe dream too. The good news is that most kids are not patient enough to waste too much time trying to have YouTube channels. So not too many people are going to fall into it and be complete and total failures. Alright, well, I really do have nothing to say about the Steam sale, so let's go ahead and go through the news. Video Games Chronicle, none of these articles opened up automatically, so I'm probably going to have duplicates, and frankly we're probably not going to have that much news today anyways. Yeah, so yeah, there's that. Certainly in the back of my mind I would like to be playing video games right now. I'd like to find a way to justify it, but there's just no possible way to do that. Like, I'm under a deadline of sorts that is slowly going forward, and because YouTube, and that just means that YouTube can't be a priority at all. If I was to start playing video games, it would just be an admission of giving up on basically everything, giving up on life effectively at this point. So yeah, really shouldn't do that. Not until I at least get the house cleaned and organized and decluttered. So anyways, Video Games Chronicle says the Epic Games Store's latest giveaway has revealed Dark and Darker Legendary status is free to claim on the Epic Games Store for 24 hours. I would assume that they are doing a different game every day, but it is still the Epic Games Store, so most people won't care too much about that. Speaking of giving up, I would love to see the Epic Games Store give up, but I imagine they never will. A Black Myth Wukong imitator, the phrase clone apparently has just stopped being used, has been listed on the Nintendo eShop, called Wukong Sun Black Legend. Although, in fairness, without even looking at it, how can you really be complaining of imitation when like Myth Wukong itself is just an imitation of Dark Souls, or at least that's how most people have taken it, as an emulator clone of Dark Souls, with just the Monkey King as protagonist, which is just a classic Chinese story. So, and inherently, there is such a limitation on the types of stories that Chinese developers in particular are encouraged to make, that there's already been hundreds of different Monkey King stories made in Monkey King games. So much so that it is boring and uninteresting to, I imagine, even people inside of China, but definitely to people outside of China. Also saw on DFRetro that there was a Donkey Kong kind of name confusion game called Monkey Kong on the eShop. So inherently, there is this weirdness on the Nintendo eShop that weird garbage games are approved, weirdly sexual games are approved, or at least lewd games are approved, and yet when something like Neptunia tries to get released, it gets this extra criticism and this extra censorship that clearly they aren't giving to other game developers. And so it definitely feels like maybe Neptunia should figure out, the developers of Neptunia and the publishers should figure out how just to cheat the system too. But instead they're fighting the good fight and probably following the rules and regulations and stopping themselves from even trying to submit some stuff. But yeah, there is just a lack of communication and a lack of consistency on the Nintendo eShop, which is a small argument to not buy the next Nintendo console, because there's no reason to believe that any of that is going to change on the next Nintendo console either. It is still going to be a case where you have no real reason to go to the eShop to buy anything other than maybe some first-party Nintendo games. It is the Nintendo eShop is almost a prime example of how not to run an eShop. And sure, we may complain that there's thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of garbage games on Steam, but nobody talks about those games. Stories don't get made about those games. Little kids don't get confused and tricked into buying those games enough for it to be a news story. And Nintendo is already curating their eShop to some level. They're not just doing a Nintendo Direct style, Steam Direct style auto submission process. I would say the garbage on the Nintendo eShop being talked about also highlights how there's plenty of weeks when there isn't a good new game to talk about on the Nintendo Switch. And yes, we are in Christmas, so there isn't a lot of new games to talk about in particular, but yeah, the Nintendo in particular has been a real problem as far as having good second-party, third-party published games on their consoles. And they've kind of always been that way. Moving on, Sega says it's weighing up launching its own game subscription service, which is perhaps a prime example of Sega overvaluing itself way too much, even if it was just like $1.99 a month, which is probably the minimum you could even charge for a subscription service. Sega does not have any kind of lineup to justify that. Perhaps if that was just like Phantasy Star Online, I'm not sure if Sega owns Phantasy Star Online, maybe then that might make sense, is if there was just like already an existing MMO that had a subscription service and then they were throwing in every other old Sega game. Which there was another story where Sega said one of the managers at Sega said that Sega is not a retro company and that they're looking towards the future. And yeah, that's probably the only way to run any kind of business, is to not be a retro company, although Atari is kind of succeeding at being a retro company. The new Atari, new company that owns the name Atari. But yeah, the vast majority of Sega's success is in its retro titles, and they are very spotty and inconsistent in just releasing games as far as what they've done in the past 10 years or so. So yeah, first of all, Sega would have to have good games before they start to think about doing a subscription service. Good new games, consistently good new games. And the fact that these kinds of things are being said out loud, I think also highlights where the truth is that Sega is just floundering. Their management is floundering, and they have no idea what to do, and they don't know how to run a successful video game company. And so they're throwing out things that stick on every bit of items that stick on the wall. Throwing spaghetti at the wall to see if it sticks is the phrase I'm trying to say here. Yeah, here's the exact next article. Coincidentally, Sega isn't planning more mini consoles. We're not a retro company. Which, yeah, stupid on their part. That was one of the few things that did have some excitement around it, but I could also see hardware costs just skyrocketing if they were going to try and release a Sega Saturn or a Dreamcast or something that would potentially have Sega CD games, which I probably don't have the rights to a lot of those games that you would want to see on those kinds of retro consoles. Yeah, clearly Sega is going in a direction different than where they've seen their most success, really, in recent time. At least that was something new and something interesting. Another Nintendo 64 game has been quietly ported to PC by fans. Starship allows Star Fox 64 owners to play the game on PC at 60 frames per second in ultra widescreen, which inherently ultra widescreen I imagine means that there will just not be too much over on the left or the right, because they're just not going to render in another mountain that nobody would see, at least at the beginning of the levels. The question here I would have is this a decompilation effort, or is this emulation? And it seems to me like this is a unofficial port is what they're calling it, so they've actually figured out how to decompile it, reverse engineer into code, and then compile it to run on modern PCs. This, with the reverse engineering, not allowing them for Ocarina of Time to add HD textures, ray tracing, HD models, and more. Yeah, Star Fox is another example of Nintendo's not really supporting enough games, or their older games, well. Which it would have been easy enough to just remaster and re-release Star Fox 64 for the Wii at the very least, and then maybe remaster it again for the Switch. You wouldn't really have had to change the game at all. I'm not even sure that they ported Star Fox 64 to be playable on the Switch. let's see. Glenn Schofield says EA recently turned down his Dead Space 4 proposal. 3 original Dead Space devs approached EA this year about making a new series entry. It seems to me like it's fairly constant that EA gets proposals and turns them down for games, continuations, sequels. Remember American McGee with his third Alice, Alice Madness Returns. Alice Asylum was the supposed name of the third game pitch. Also, I believe, went to EA because EA owned the rights to that. Although, maybe I'm wrong about that. That might actually be a Ubisoft title and not a EA games. It's probably the same though. I imagine these companies get pitches all the time from even industry insiders and just reject them because A, it wouldn't be the idea of the upper management there. B, they wouldn't have budgeted for it. C, they may have some metrics and numbers, and none of these publishers have just piles of money that they're sitting on. No, they take the piles of money that they get and they put it into the pockets of the CEOs and the upper management. So, much like movie production companies, but way worse, there just isn't any incentive to reinvest and try and make any game that you hadn't planned on making, or any game that won't make as much money. Dead Space 4 as a horror game is just not going to make as much money as a general, more generic first-person shooter military game. At least that's what the history says. And in fairness, I think they probably do have some good metrics there, in that the Dead Space remake, while it may have sold pretty well, probably didn't sell well enough to justify remaking Dead Space 2 or going in a different direction with a split universe, alternate retelling of the events of Dead Space, to kind of avoid Dead Space 3 from being the same game. And yeah, skipping all of that and just having Dead Space 4 honestly doesn't make that much sense anyways. Honestly, if we wanted a Dead Space 2, the thing to do would be to make Callisto Protocol 2 and move, maybe trick EA into competing against that. That might work again. And these guys going public about being rejected means that they for certain know that they aren't going to be hired to make a Dead Space 4. They must have gotten a very solid no to their pitch. Otherwise, they would be more professional and stay quiet about it. And inherently, I wonder if they are really just hyping up the beginning of them starting their own company to make some kind of spiritual successor to Dead Space. Which, in all honesty, spiritual successors to Dead Space makes more sense than continuing the story of Dead Space, because the first Dead Space story itself is a deeply personal, kind of smart story to tell, and they went in the wrong. I mean, they really couldn't go much further with the story anyways in Dead Space 2 or Dead Space 3, because by the time you're at Dead Space 3, it's really just a couple military guys trying to save the entire world, more than the deeply personal Isaac story of here's a person who's crazy, potentially hallucinating, and going through a horrific event. Yeah. So yeah, a spiritual successor showing a new character going through similar events makes sense. Kind of like Silent Hill, and I guess that's one thing that Silent Hill did that was fairly bold, is that most of the Silent Hill games did have different protagonists, and they were in some horrific world called Silent Hill, but it didn't inherently have to be the same world or connected as much. Although it definitely seems like if they were going to make new Silent Hill games, they probably are going to try and connect the world a little bit more. I feel like I'm already running out of steam today. Yeah, I feel off. Like my head's a little light. I'd like to lie down. I might be getting even less healthy as I speak. Yeah, you would think all the physical activity of cleaning house and decluttering might be healthy bit of exercise, but no, I don't think that's really happening. Let's see. This is probably already come and gone as far as Wizards of Legend being given away, if I was to guess. We talked about this in the last stream, that the game industry will only have room for one non-Nintendo console next year. It's being claimed by a research firm. Either Sony or Microsoft will struggle mightily. So, don't think I have too much more to say about that. Definitely seems like Microsoft is making moves to potentially exit the hardware market, leaving Sony to still probably struggle. I think even if Microsoft stopped making Xbox hardware, you may find that PlayStation 5 Pro just does not sell enough compared to what Sony wants, and you may see that Sony also exits the market, which that wouldn't be great for consoles, because then you would also see that Nintendo would just get incredibly lazy, like 6 to 8 years before the next Nintendo console, on top of the fact that the next Nintendo Switch is probably only going to be incrementally better anyways. But yeah, I could see Microsoft just saying, you know what, we're going to just lay off a bunch of people and stop making hardware, and Sony doing exactly the same, and then being happy enough by just laying off people and saving money that way instead of developing a new console. We may even see a third party step in there outside of just the Steam Deck or a Steam console that plugs into a TV. Although I don't think it makes a lot of sense for any new person, even Microsoft and Sony, having their own little proprietary operating systems. I think that is going to go the way of the dinosaur, really. And you are just going to have things running Android or things running Linux as their operating system. And at some point, I could see somebody like Samsung saying, hey, we're going to throw in a bunch of our Exynos cell phone chips into a giant die, just have a lot of parallel processing going on, and make a game console that is running our One UI Android interface. With enough tweaking, with enough work, I could see phone companies doing that. And they may be just cheaper devices. There may just be a lot of different companies doing that in general, just saying, we figured out how to take our cell phone tech and make it into a powerful console device, and we're going to sell it for a lot cheaper, although price would be competing against like the PlayStation 5 Pro, so I don't know how cheaper they would have to be for that to really sell. Like, we've already started to see a little bit of that in the fact that more and more you're having cell phones that run emulators, cell phone chips and hardware running emulators for cheap Chinese Famiclone ripoff consoles versus built-in hardware family clone chips that have used to be used exclusively. There's still a lot of NES ripoffs, family clones, that are still using built-in hardware chips, but I think eventually you will just see really low power, low performance cell phones taking over that market. One of the things I have to admit while I was opening all this news is it is getting more difficult to pay attention and remember and care even about video game news when I'm not playing video games. It is very much just a case that since I'm so focused on other things and just watching a lot of streaming shows and a lot of TV, I'm getting out of the habit, certainly, of being so video game focused, which is not ideally what I would want, although I do occasionally want to watch a movie here and there or watch TV here and there. I am also doing way too much of it, more than I'd really like. These may all be older stories. We had already talked about Sonic 4 movie already being greenlit. We already talked about a Nintendo of American manager getting the DICE Lifetime Award. BAFTA. Let's see, this is yet another game that's already come and gone. So, yeah, all of these stories are older. We'll just kind of skip through all these. Which that definitely makes a lot of sense. But there really shouldn't have been more than a couple of stories. I do think I saw somewhere that they confirmed that there will be sex scenes involving Ciri in Witcher 4, in the same way that there were sex scenes that were mostly optional and mostly obvious in Witcher 3 with Geralt. That being said, times have changed more than you would have thought between the release of Witcher 3 and Witcher 4, and yeah, my experience of Witcher 3 was actively trying to avoid any sex scenes, and even at that, there was at least nudity of a woman being horrifically tortured in one scene that I recall. I ended up seeing, I'm not sure if I edited it out or not. I can't help but wonder if there is going to be this completely different standard applied to Twitch and YouTube, where Twitch kind of went out of their way to say, yes, the nudity in Witcher 3 is something we will allow if you don't focus too much on it. And I'm not even sure what YouTube says right now on it, but the reality is YouTube would almost certainly strike your channel / delete your channel once again if you have any nudity in it at all. So I imagine that is going to bite people in the butt unless there's a toggle to make sure it's not shown. But yeah, I imagine there will be this awkward double standard in that because Ciri is a female, that all the sex scenes in Witcher 4 are going to be forbidden on Twitch and YouTube. Ciri, I believe I saw, might be bisexual, so it may very well be female on female action more often than not. So yeah, there is almost certainly going to be a double standard there that occurs. Witchers are supposed to be sterile, but then Ciri also is a female witcher, which that's never happened before, which may be in the lore part of the problem why people are aren't super happy with Ciri being the protagonist in Witcher 4. Although the concern I heard was that we're going to find Ciri as a Witcher part of a clan of other female Witchers, which, if that's the case, then that changes the entirety of the lore of what Witchers are. Instead of Ciri being special by being a female Witcher, then she stops being special and the lore gets changed drastically. Although, I suppose it is also worth pointing out that nobody really is talking about The Witcher 4 anymore at this point, and I'm not seeing conversations being had on Reddit. Maybe that's because it's Christmas, maybe because it was just not really anything to be said in the first place. I still wonder if the entirety of that fake controversy, which is what I think it really was a fake controversy. Maybe it was real, maybe not. But I think it was really just trolls and people on the internet just joking, and that there really was not a significant number of people that actually cared at all about Ciri being the new protagonist. I half suspect if it wasn't intentional, just advertisement by controversy from CD Projekt Red themselves pushing that concept, that the problem here is you inherently do have people like Kotaku or other very SJW-y mainstream video game journalists that somehow become mainstream when they really didn't deserve it, who push those ideas and promote those ideas. One troll, one joke tweet somewhere on Twitter gets repeated by the likes of Kotaku and other sites. I'm not saying Kotaku actually did it here, I'm just using Kotaku as an example. But yeah, one joke tweet gets republished by one video game journalist that then gets republished by hundreds of other video game journalists, making a story out of nothing. Yeah. Meanwhile, I still would hold to the idea that there's better conversations being had around the trailer for The Witcher 4, in that it is just a pre-rendered cutscene, in that Ciri as a Witcher doesn't seem like she's trying to collect any money for saving the lady, and in that they are probably going to try and push graphics way more than you really need to push it, which that in itself is a conversation that needs to be had. It needs to really just be enough is enough as far as pushing and promoting ultra hyper realistic graphics that only are pushing people to buy new consoles or buy new computer hardware, particularly if there's just going to be tariffs in the United States. There's going to be enough is enough on pushing visuals. Even the PS5 Pro, I think, should be called out for the fact that it literally really did nothing to improve anything other than graphics. Didn't really improve the CPU speed, didn't really improve the storage speed, it didn't really improve the audio. Any other factor. It didn't change the controllers, it didn't change the inputs, didn't reduce latency, didn't reduce network speed. It's just visuals. And I think inherently the visuals are good enough for a while. So yeah, this Killzone 2 crossover led to controversy, and I think in part because of the Christmas element there, it's just not getting reported enough. But basically what I understand is that this armor is generally pretty good, and that you get a lot less in this Killzone 2 DLC. than what you normally would get. So it's just like really overpriced and slightly overpowered. So they definitely were not happy about that. Now the good news about Helldivers 2 is that the creators of the game actually seem to listen for the most part and seem like they are going to try and fix some of it, or at least smooth over some of the actions they've taken. And so it's already been several times in which Helldivers 2 has done something that the players have not really liked, and yet the players don't seem to be outwardly boycotting the game. They seem to just complain and then have their complaints resolved. So there's an actual dialogue there that's almost unheard of in video games, where the creator is actually listening to the player base and following the player base for the most part. I also saw a story, and I don't know if we're going to cover it today, that there are accusations that Activision, I assume in one of its Call of Duty games, is using AI generated art for skins and tags and things like that, and just a whole lot of AI slop. The phrase slop is something I think I've been keenly aware of for the past couple days, and it seems like it's going to be used a lot more as a phrase, not just AI slop, but slop in general, as far as just garbage content, garbage games, perhaps. I definitely could say that a lot of the low effort asset flip games that they come out on Steam could be described as slop a lot easier than me calling them low effort asset flip games. Same thing with the Gematsu. I had to open all of them manually, so kind of don't even want to read the headlines. That certainly wouldn't help anybody who's blind trying to listen, though. But like Natsumi's Book of Friends, Azuki no Shirushi, launches June 5th, 2025 in Japan for Switch and PC. Bleach Rebirth of Souls has a character trailer for Shinji Hirako. So it's one of the characters that was fairly late in the original Bleach anime series, and he was definitely getting into the realm of being a weirder character. Leader of the Vizord. Vizored. I don't know how you'd pronounce that. But yeah, particularly in the original series, he felt like he was just a filler arc of a character, which makes it very weird for him to come back in the new 1000-Year Blood arc series even a little bit. Let's see, Windbreaker Rebel Heroes launches March 12th in Japan, which a windbreaker is a jacket, and they all are wearing jackets, but I'd have to assume that there's something more to it than that. Some kind of RPG game. I'd assume maybe it's a beat 'em up kind of gang style RPG game. Although maybe there's less beating it up as I would have thought. Oh, it is fighting. There's the end of the year talk around Metaphor ReFantasio has been high enough that I could see myself with infinite money and infinite time wanting to play that game. And certainly that would be a new kind of like a new fantasy series, easy to start with. But yeah, there is inherently a question there that needs to be answered as far as if tomorrow I had infinite money, infinite time, well, let's take the infinite time off the table, because that's the real question, is if tomorrow a brand new JRPG came out, it was super hype, super popular, how could I fit that into my recording schedule? And I just don't know a real way to do that. Yeah, I don't know how anybody plays any of the games that they claim to have played without being either a Twitch streamer that just plays them as soon as they come out as fast as possible, or without being a insider who gets early access to the game. Yeah. Even when I did play Witcher 3, which was very close to its launch date, I didn't really get any views, and I found that whole process to be very difficult. Yeah, I personally just don't have the ability to sit and play games for 8 hours to 16 hours a day. So yeah. Perhaps I could do like a first look type video very early and hype up the rest of a long play. And that is a thought, certainly, is that I could put out first look videos very early, as far as here's what the experience it has been so far, and then the long plays could come out like months later. Although months later is too long. It really would have to be that the scheduled videos would have to start coming out like maybe a week or two later at most. Certainly that is a thought. Of course, I'm not really going through video game news here. Fragaria, which I assume is the company's name, has announced a new sci-fi mystery visual novel called Stellar Code for PC. This is the studio behind Tales from Toyotoki, Arrival of the Witch. Yeah. Kind of an inconsistent art style here. Like this picture here looks nice. Little soft pastels, but then head on, the angles are a little off character here. And then over here the picture is a little off too. And you would expect that visual novels, since they only really do have visuals, need to be very on model and very good. And there's just this kind of soft pastel look to all of it that feels weird. Let's see, Palworld's Faybreak update is now available. I haven't heard anybody say anything. Inherently, I think this is an example of, unless you just don't want people talking about your updates, you shouldn't be putting updates out around Christmas. Weirdly, mobile games probably still do put out Christmas updates anyways. Cell phone games would, and live service games would. But you might as well not spend the effort to make any Christmas updates, knowing that all the video game news is just going to shut down at the end of the year and be talking about Game of the Year content anyways. Speaking of mobile games, I'm still playing Memento Mori, and I'm still playing Pokemon Pocket. I have to say that even when you don't have to have 5 consecutive wins to win one of the events, which is probably the next event that's going to happen for Pokemon Pocket, to just have to have 45 wins is asking quite a lot. And there's just a weird limiting factor on Pokemon Pocket in that I am playing a lot of it these days, and I am hitting the maximum number of rewards you can get in a day very early in the day, probably around noon or so, just halfway through whatever my day is. So if you really want to play Pokemon, it's a bad game because it stops rewarding you for playing Pokemon about halfway through the day. If you really don't want to play Pokemon, it's a bad game because it's just trying to suck money out of you. I did get my second highlight card that has the high animation where you go into the card and you look around and it's a much bigger environment. For this expansion, it's Celebi EX that does that, which is just the picture on the packaging. So I would have to assume that for the first expansion, there probably is a single card in the Pikachu card that is that high animation, and there's just Celebi in this smaller expansion, and that's it. So the main sales factor that they sold Pokemon Pocket on, that all the cards would look fancy and have this weird new animation where you go inside the cards, is basically a lie. They've done it for 2 cards out of about 300 cards available. Now, this latest expansion is changing up the balance somewhat on Pokemon, but not so much. I've won this current event very single-handedly just by playing the same Pikachu deck I was playing before. None of the new cards are really changing it that much. So it's unfortunately way too boring of a game. Way more boring of a game than it should be. And yet I probably will just stick with it. I would hope I would stop playing it so much. I imagine once I start making content, I will stop focusing on it so much. I guess it is also worth pointing out that if I am playing Momentum Mori and Pokemon Pocket, I am playing video games instead of cleaning house, and so it is really just a big distraction. Although they do have daily quests too, so you either commit to the daily quest or you don't. Kaiju number 8, the game, has new key visual character screenshots. This looks like this might be new news too. Although I suspect we'll go through the Komatsu stories and eventually stop seeing new news. Same story here as far as this guy. I'd say Bleach's animation style in particular had this problem in that there is a wide variety of character designs in Bleach, and some of them make sense and some of them are just weird, creepy people. And yeah, had he planned out the Bleach series and thought it through more, I imagine there would have been considerably fewer characters, more thought out, more consistent on character designs. But yeah, it definitely feels particularly like the artist every now and then just got the whim to make a completely weird character, weird looking character, and throw him into the mix, which kind of hurts the consistency. And that's not even like later in the series. Chad in particular is a friend that's basically there from the very first episode of Bleach, the Bleach anime at least, and he's just completely underutilized, feels completely out of place, and kind of just a background character for no good reason. And yeah, that they should have either done more with him or eliminated him as a character. In particular, he feels like he's from Mexico, and yet somehow he's in a Japanese school surrounded by other Japanese humans at the beginning of the series. I'd say that Orihime too is underutilized as a character, as another schoolmate, and a lot of schoolmates are definitely underutilized, but almost all of them are. But yeah, Orihime feels like she's supposed to be a love interest of Ichigo in Bleach, and it just never really goes anywhere. Moving on, speaking of weird looking characters, Fatal Fury City of Wolves adds Gato. I think we had probably already talked about this. Gato being Spanish, I believe, for cat, thus the kind of leopard prints on his kimono. Octopath Travelers series shipments and digital sales have topped 5 million. Yeah. Octopath Traveler, a very recent, newer JRPG series that still would be very manageable since there's only 2 of them to get into. Let's see, Bandai Namco and Koei Tecmo announced Kingdom Hado for iOS and Android. This almost certainly won't come to the West. It seems to me like this is way too feudal Japan style gameplay and story. Yeah, when you really look at it, it definitely does just feel and look like a mobile game. And I'd have to think about it as far as, is this really how mobile games are going to potentially get better? Are we just going to have companies like Bandai and Koei Tecmo trying to copy the kind of low effort mobile games that have existed before and just hope that their branding or their artistry might influence the quality upward in any way? So far, I would say that's probably not the case here. This is definitely feels like this is just Bandai and Koei trying to do what others have already done as far as low effort mobile games. Although, in fairness, everybody who has tried to do high quality mobile games has kind of failed. Like Nintendo, I think, tried to do a little bit more high quality with like Super Mario Run, and that failed. Bethesda definitely had that Elder Scrolls game on Apple for a while, iPhones, and that was definitely more high quality, but it still kind of failed. It really is just a completely different group of people who make mobile games and succeed compared to those who make console games or any other kind of game, any other kind of video game. The only real success we've seen as far as crossover has been likes of Shift Up, and I believe there's another Korean company that's going to try and do this too, where they've gone from making mobile games to making more console games. Shift Up making Stellar Blade, having only previously made 2 other mobile games. Let's see, Ys vs. Trails of the Sky Alternative Saga is coming to the West in 2025 for the PS4 and 5, the Switch, and the PC. Ys series, I think, is too long of a running series really to get into at this point. Plus it has, I think, a lot of side quest games. Let's see. Terminator 2 No Fate has been rated for all consoles and PC in Australia. One assumes this is a new Terminator game from Reef Entertainment. I almost wonder if this might have been a case where this was just a remake of a 3D VR game, or yeah, that would be my thought. Because I feel like there was a Terminator Dark Fate game maybe they're just confusing, trying to create some name confusion there. Visually, I wouldn't say this looks particularly great, though. Although in fairness, I do think that the Terminator series, much like the Indiana Jones series, is probably going to do it best if it just transitions to being video games instead of trying to make movies around it. Because, yeah, Arnold Schwarzenegger is just not going to be really able to come back, and unless you're just going to do a soft reboot of the Terminator movies, which you could remake Terminator 1 and Terminator 2 and do a soft remake there. Buy yourself a lot of time to think of a new Terminator 3 movie to have a rebooted trilogy, although that's really never worked with movies in the past. I do think we will eventually get to that point that where you're just having remakes of older movies with new actors. That being said, it hasn't worked yet. They didn't try to make a new Titanic or a new Gone with the Wind or anything like that. Which, if that was going to happen, you would have thought somebody would have done that. Which is kind of funny because when you think of stage plays, like, there have been at least 5 different groups of actors that have done the Phantom of the Opera on stage on Broadway. As far as stage plays go, there's been, I would assume, at least 4 or 5 different runs of Jesus Christ Superstar with different actors and different characters. There's one going on right now even, but that doesn't translate for some reason to movies, because I guess movies just lock it down. Some movies have been remade, like The Blob and The Thing, so it did work at one time, but also those movies were fairly different. Anyways, moving on. Man, I'm out of steam more than usual. There definitely is something to just talking for so long and sitting upright for so long. I really do spend way more time laying down than any normal person should. It does just suck the energy out of me. Anyways, Tetris Forever update is now available, adding Weltris, which I assume is just another Tetris variant. I do recognize the name Weltris. But I couldn't tell you anything special about it. Genshin Impact version 5.3 update, Incandescent Ode of Resurrection, launches January 1st, 2025. And Setna launches January 31st, 2025 for Switch and PC, and then Q1 for PS5 and Xbox Series. And then, yeah, Gaming on Linux, I bet, barely has any new news at all. Team Fortress 2 Comic Issue 7 is finally officially available. I believe this came out like 7 years later than the last issue. Which, yeah. I think that's what I had heard, that and that just seems like that is ridiculous long amount of time. Even if this was the case where they were releasing one issue a year, that would be a ridiculous long amount of time. And I can't help but wonder if maybe this is them thinking about wrapping up Team Fortress 2, or somebody who works on Team Fortress 2 comics leaving Valve. and this being their send-off. One would hope that with issue 7 they've kind of wrapped everything up and that they wouldn't go any further. It does, to me, seem like a waste of focus for them to be hiring anybody to make comics to promote Team Fortress 2 in particular, when there would definitely be a much better job, a much better way of doing promotion, and that Valve just needs to finish their next game, Deadlock, and have a publishing company working independently to promote and sell Deadlock, and just have external people who actually can meet deadlines work around promoting the game. These may all be updates we've already talked about, so Direct 3D to Vulkan transition layer, fixing things like The Sims 2, Borderlands 2, Alpha Protocol, Mesa released with more graphical driver bug fixes for Linux. These constant updates. Fireaccess reveals that Sid Meier's Civ 7 system requirements for Linux, which, let's see, doesn't seem to be particularly high requirements by any means. Storage at 25 gigs is about still the biggest thing there. Let's see, the third release candidate for Wine 10.0 is out. So they're putting out release candidates, and then if the release candidates have bugs, they're putting out patched versions of the release candidates. Although inherently release candidates ideally wouldn't have bugs. There's a demo up for Warside and a new release window. Yep. Mostly they just have the Merry Christmas. And that they're not likely going to be working too much. And then GameDeveloper.com has a lot of wrap-ups as far as top 10 must-play games of the year, in their opinion. There is a lot of gambling aspects in Balatro, which, while I still don't think it probably should have been rated as NC-17 or whatever it was rated as in whatever country that rated it so highly, I kind of do see their point, though. Like, the game is, from the gameplay I saw, exclusively around the ideas of money being exchanged to some random probability, some gambling aspects, and while there is a lot of wild, crazy stuff that changes the cards in wild, crazy ways that you wouldn't have seen in any other kind of gambling game, there still is money, anteing, and you at least mostly are dealing with a standard deck of playing cards. I don't know where you would draw the line as far as having gambling elements. And their argument kind of does make sense. That if you were a parent that didn't want your kid to learn how to gamble, then you would not want your kid to play Balatro. If you were more of an average parent who probably already knows your kid knows how to gamble, or could learn it word of mouth from another kid very quickly, that argument falls apart, though. But yeah, there is a weird line in the sand being made there, in that, like, the original Pokemon games had slot machines in them, and yet that's really just a game as much as the rest of the Pokemon game were. So I'm not sure if this Cryptmaster game was the one where you had to spell things. I think it is. Yeah, this indicator certainly got talked about in a lot of articles, and yet I still didn't get around to it, although the same is true for Silent Hill 2. And in reality, all the new games that came out this year, I didn't really get anywhere with. I suppose it is worth mentioning that TF Retro's fan base and popularity, popular vote, is putting Astrobot well ahead in first place anyways. So it does seem like real gamers, or at least fan gamers that watch TF Retro, also loved Astrobot way more. Tencent removed directors from the Epic Games after a Justice Department inquiry, effectively saying that the Justice Department said that Tencent, being assumed to be under tight control of the Chinese government, cannot have directors on the Epic Games board, since that's an American company. The Justice Department voiced concerns that Tencent was being anti-competitive by appointing its own directors to Epic, which it only has a minority stake in it. Which, yeah, in a lot of ways, I assume this is more of a shareholder's complaint than an actual concern to protect gamers or protect the gaming industry in the United States. But yeah, that was a fairly quick response and resolution, which tends not to be what happens. Usually it gets fought in court forever. ZeniMax is going to pivot Elder Scrolls Online to seasonal content. After 8 annual expansions, Elder Scrolls Online is shifting to seasonal structure so that ZeniMax has a lighter load and can launch content when it's ready. Although, it feels like to me what they're really saying here is that it's not going to be winter, fall, summer, spring, as in there will be 4 smaller updates for Elder Scrolls Online, as much as there will be a Season 1 and a Season 2, and a Season 1 might take a year or 2 or 3 to release content. Seasons are expected to run for 3 or 6 months, which is a wide gap. So yeah, 3 months is closer to winter, fall, spring, although it may not exactly line up. So yeah, less content more often, I assume, is what you're going to get, which inherently we're not really that closer to the next true single player Elder Scrolls game, so I don't think this helps speed up that development at all. I can't help but wonder if this is just another example of Microsoft being far too hands-off with all of its acquisitions, which that might change. That might change very quickly if they're not making hardware anymore. If all of a sudden Phil Spencer has nothing to do in his office other than to look into why games aren't being released on time or why games aren't being released in good quality, which are often contradictory issues, but yeah, if he's not thinking about hardware as much and he can't think about acquisitions as much, which I assume that they're going to struggle to be allowed to acquire any other companies at this point. I think Phil Spencer should, and very well might, but I kind of doubt it, start to look at ZeniMax in particular and look at the management there and say how much of this management really needs to exist versus being let go, or look at the way things are done in general at ZeniMax and start to have a real schedule. ZeniMax alone has enough games where there should be something coming out every quarter of major note, of major importance, a big seller, and it's just not really happening and hasn't been happening. Let's see, Hothead Games has shut down after almost 20 years, which honestly, it's a sad statement to say 20 years is probably a more than average run for game companies. the whole model is really just a mess overall. Let's see. 15% of Steam users played 2024 games releases. That seems to highlight that a lot of Steam players, not just me, are going back to older games. Only 15% of Steam players spent their time on games released in 2024. Conversely, 47% of players played games from the past 1 to 7 years. That's not particularly surprising numbers, really, when you think about it, though. 2024 had very few must play it now style games anyways, and it is fairly commonplace that Steam PC gamers are used to buying games outside of their launch window, whether that's a year later or more, to get those deep summer sale and winter sale discounts. Yeah, the games on sale right now during the winter sale are not likely going to be heavily discounted if they came out in this year. If something is heavily discounted and it came out this year, it's probably doing very poorly as far as its sales numbers or its quality. Top 5 trends that defined 2024 according to Game Developer. Let's see. Execs save their own skins by putting developers to the sword. Generative AI transforms game developing by aping what devs have been doing for years, but worse. The fight for video game preservation heats up and really didn't succeed in any way, as far as I know. It's getting too expensive to make games in the US and other high cost of living regions. Girl power grew. I would say very minimally, and that is more certainly, I think, a SJW thing. One of the animes I started watching was I don't want to get hurt, so I maxed out my defense is the long title of the anime series, and it's 2 anime children. I imagine they're supposed to be close to like 11 or 12 girls that are going into VR MMOs and playing together with each other. And what's interesting about that certainly is just how uncommon that really is in every other depiction. Like every other fantasy isekai anime, it almost always is a guy, and the guy inevitably gets some kind of harem of female people that are romantically interested in him, depending on how far they go in that storyline. Often varies. That time I got reincarnated as slime. They really don't do much with it, but certainly still there. And it is interesting I maxed out my defense in that they are totally capable of coming in and out and logging in and out of the VR MMO. So it's not like Sword Art Online or something like that where you're just getting trapped into the world and have to stay in that world, which creates an interesting kind of laid back experience. The virtual MMO game that they're playing also is brand new, which is weird because there are some people there that have been for a while, but they're doing like the very first events ever. Anyways, that's a long ramble that has nothing to do with what I was really trying to say, is that I don't think girl power really has gone up much. A little bit, sure. Nintendo came out with 2 girl games this year in the Zelda game, where you actually play as Zelda, and the Princess Peach Showdown game. Infinite Nikke, I think, is out, though it hasn't been talked about that much. But yeah, I suspect every year there are more girl gamers, and I suspect that will increase the desire to play as female characters. But yeah, I definitely don't think there's been a massive change there, really. And I think when you really get down to it, when you're in the preschools and the kindergartens and the elementary schools, when you're talking under the age of 12, under the age of 11 and 10, I think there is already just this passed down gendered way of thinking where little boys probably don't want to play as female characters, little girls probably don't want to play as male characters, and the balance of most games is still very much going to be fairly leaning towards targeting male players and not really accommodating female players. Yeah. And I don't think a top-down change of video game selectable characters is going to change that much, because I think those attitudes and thoughts are passed down from generation to generation in kindergarten, really, well before kids play any games. Or the kids are playing like preschool baby games, and even the baby games are explaining that. Even if you look at like early education little storyboards and nighttime stories and things like that, all of those stories, unless they go out of their way, are heavily gendered and push gendered biases well more. Even in general, kids being born are heavily impressed on the fact that the mother tends to do all the work raising a newborn, and the father is practically non-existent there. And yeah, there would have to be drastic societal changes for that to really change that much. And gaming can do its part, certainly. Like, pretty much every game should have selectable characters where you can play as a boy, girl, or a gendered character, although often that may hurt the story quite a bit if that is the case, but often games don't have that much of a story for it to really hurt that much. And you have to admit too that Princess Peach Showtime was over talked about, and they never announced any numbers to indicate it sold particularly well or that it was a particularly good game. And the Zelda game was over talked about, but it really wasn't played that much. It's also worth mentioning that there are just, I think, general activities, desires, and that are different between your average boy versus your average girl. In that, yeah, I'm not sure girls, even raised in a vacuum, would prefer video games and that kind of interactive entertainment, because we see it over and over again that reading in particular is often much more popular with females than it is with males, so that their brains just work differently, and that has to be admitted. And so yeah, in particular, I would say if this really was going to be the rise of girl gaming or girl power growing, it wouldn't be the case that you're highlighting Nintendo putting out 2 experimental things. You would be highlighting a sales of visual novels in particular. A lot of it is cultural too, in the United States and the West, and too also. It's much, much more common for Japanese girls to be into manga and into video games a little bit more than United States girls. So there's a heavy cultural aspect to it too. Anyways, I feel like I'm rambling here. 5 devs that made Impact, Godot engine having a big impact, I would say, perhaps mostly because of the Unreal Engine more, or the Unity engine having such a negative response to them changing their license and then undoing those changes. Godot really was just the benefactor from Unity engine's mistake. I do know the Godot engine donated something, though, so perhaps that's what they're talking about. I will say it probably was a little bit more controversial to have developers like GSC Gaming World, or the developers of Stalker 2, flying a Ukrainian flag and supporting Ukraine. Like at January 1st, that probably was slightly more controversial. Nowadays, it's mostly seen as acceptable, except for the people who completely see it's not acceptable, and I doubt there's been any change in that opinion over the course of the year. Microsoft's accessibility team getting any applause, I think, is undue, in that they really have done very little and just partnered with other people to claim credit for things they really didn't do. Plus, those accessibility controllers, still way overpriced, still incredibly not accessible, in the sense that if I was going to go down to a Walmart or a GameStop and try and buy an accessibility controller, there wouldn't be one on the shelf. There wouldn't be a way to order one through those stores or any guidance there to. In fact, if somebody saw those commercials and said, hey, I need to get that, I'm not sure that even the commercials themselves pointed you in the right direction onto how to order those controllers. I have no idea if they even really have been in stock. I also would have to question what does this mean? The different colored but not quite rainbow colored lightning bolt, and what is, like, this is I love you, I guess, in hand sign language. But yeah, I don't think, well, is that I love you? I think it is, because I know there's a different way. If the, yeah, oh yeah, if the thumb is in, it's Hail Satan, but if the thumb is out, it's I love you. Yeah, that's what I was trying to remind myself there, sorry. But yeah, like, this controller is just a basic controller. A brain is just a brain. And I have no idea what this is supposed to be, unless this is supposed to be specifically for, like, people with epilepsy or something like that. But yeah, I don't think the accessibility deserves credit. I don't know why Capcom is the model for AAA development. Maybe they're just saying Capcom is under budget, I don't know. I don't even know what the UGC, user generated content platforms. I don't know why you'd highlight that either, as far as impact. Then they're giving out staff picks, at least one person's staff picks, Bryant Fraser's top 10 games of the year, which I have no idea who Bryant Fraser is. GameDeveloper.com, really not the place where I go for reviews, because there is no place I go for reviews. But GameDeveloper.com tends not to even really review games enough for them to be a source that you would want to follow. Anyways, let's go through all the games that came out on Steam, or that I think it came out on Steam. Now, I went back to December 20th until it started to look like games I'd already seen. So, There may be some repetition here. Man, yeah, I just feel really exhausted, really tired today. And I know that's a whine, certainly, and it's not something people care to hear. But yeah, I definitely am feeling it. See, inherently this is a problem, is that I just woke up and I'm streaming for just a couple hours, and then I am more than likely just going to go back to sleep. Oh no, I may have opened too many tabs at once. We shall see. Yeah, now's not the time for flawless cleanup, although inherently this is probably the perfect time scheduling wise for a flawless cleanup. But yeah, I wouldn't really be able to pull that off either. Wouldn't be the worst idea to bring in somebody different to do something for my channel, do a crossover collab, but yeah, that wouldn't happen. I wouldn't have anybody to begin with to even think about that. A lot of the makers are doing this Christmas thing they do every year where they do a Secret Santa, sort of, but the Secret Santa goes in circles, so everybody makes only one gift for one person, and then it makes a playlist loop of videos. Problem with it is that they are all very different types of makers, so you'll have like one maker like Colin Furs who it can do something more electronic and crazy and wild, and then the next person is a artist that works with cardboard and is just cutting down a cardboard box to paint and make a cartoonified mailbox out of cardboard. It's just like a very wild variety in what makers are. In the general, anybody would be called a maker if they're making anything, but that's just like a very wide description, in the same way that anybody can be called a gamer if they play any games, or a video gamer if they play any video games. And so yeah, out of that ring of different makers, it's only 2 or 3 of them that I actually actively follow and want to watch. A lot of times it's the mediums they work in, a lot of times it's the ideas. One of them does pretty good work, but only does it to make music and synthesis. Here's another one of these games that probably shouldn't be showing. Nothing's been curated because I manually opened everything today. Now, I suppose in contrast, instead of doing a Secret Santa, if you're going to make special Christmas events content, which you probably shouldn't as a maker, you probably should work at your own pace and make good videos and good products instead of rushing to make something silly for Secret Santa. But the Secret Santa concept and collabing, I do think is probably a little bit better than just doing end of the year recaps of everything you've created otherwise, because let's face it, most makers really are only going to have so many things There's a beat-up game that wouldn't have been curated anyways, but it definitely feels like it's showing a lot of skin. It's fairly lewd. Yeah. I feel like there was a game like this already. I don't know how many games like that you really shouldn't make. Yeah, this close to Christmas, I'm not expecting any of these games to really be particularly good. And so, I guess it is also worth pointing out that Christmas will happen December 25th, so that'll be Wednesday. I plan on just having a regular old stream, which, if it's anything like today, won't be particularly impressive or particularly high energy. And I imagine there will just be no new news and only a small number of new games, so might get a little lucky and spend less time streaming on Wednesday. I did make some YouTube shorts, closing a bunch of tabs, but the current version of Firefox, which Firefox, I have to say, has been really bad about its updates, does seem to crash tabs more often, which, yeah, if a tab crashes, then my macro probably won't work, because that's probably the tab that's going to crash. So I probably should turn off like the auto update on Firefox if you even can. Definitely does want to update far more often than it really should. Gotta say no to that. I really have to do question. It's just, what am I really contributing in these live streams, particularly when I'm just not feeling high energy or feeling good, not feeling awake, not feeling healthy. At some point, this is information I too wanted to know and want to probably still know, but I'll put this on the fall list, but I'm not going to make a YouTube short on it. But yeah, I've long since kind of stopped looking at these games and having anything to say on them. And video game news I do still want to know. But I could see where I could be the second mic and put somebody else in charge of being the first mic, of just reading the articles, and I could appreciate just sitting there and listening and then throwing in an opinion. But yeah, could also see myself just being the director behind the screens. More than likely, my voice and my lack of desire to have a camera in front of me does really highlight that I'm not the right personality to be running a YouTube channel. Yeah, and because my macro didn't work, I don't even have the end screen, so that's the last tab. Yep. So that's gonna be it. Kind of a slightly low energy, slightly not feeling good stream. I'll try and get these stickers off screen on for the Christmas sale, and that's probably about all I'm gonna do as far as video games and YouTube. Anyways, that's going to be it for the stream. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and keep on watching. Thanks.